Roderick Chisholm's The Problem of the Criterion, originally a lecture at Marquette University in 1973, and later in 1982 a chapter in his book The Foundations of Knowing. This is quite simply one of the most wonderful things in epistemology I've ever seen. The problem of the criterion is this. In order to say I know something, and to know that I know it, I need to have a criterion for knowledge. I need to know what it is that distinguishes knowledge from what is not knowledge, from ignorance, or from merely lucky true belief, instead of knowledge, which is true belief, which, as I've discussed in various other videos, has that thing that ties the truth down to belief, that third thing and possibly more, depending on the proper solution to the Gettier problem. So it seems that I need to know what makes the difference between knowledge and what is not knowledge. I seem to need to know how to get knowledge in order to know that I have any. But it seems that in order to know what is a criterion for knowledge, I must know some knowledge. I must have some knowledge. I must know what I know in order to be sure that the criterion works. I must be able to test the criterion on some knowledge. And so we have the makings of a very fine skeptical argument, an argument that we human beings don't know anything in the problem of the criterion. The argument would go something like this. In order to know something, I must have a criterion for knowledge. But in order to have a criterion for knowledge, I must first know something. In order to do one, I must first do the other. And so I'm stuck. I can't do either, and therefore I cannot have any knowledge. Chisholm lays out this problem and this skeptical paradox, and he explains what our options are. There's the option of skepticism. There is surrendering, saying we humans do not have knowledge, and that's just the way it's going to have to be, and we might as well admit it. Then there's the option of naive dogmatism. A naive dogmatist might say something like this. I have a criterion for knowledge. It's such and such. And I know that that criterion works because it gives me these items of knowledge. And I know that these things are knowledge because they're satisfied by the criterion. Maybe I should plug something into that formula. A naive dogmatist might say, I know that the Bible is the criterion for knowledge, and that gives me certain items of knowledge, such as this and that and the other theological point. And I know that those things are true because I'm taught them in the Bible. And again, I know the Bible is the criterion for knowledge because it gives me these true articles of knowledge, which I know are true because the Bible is the criterion for knowledge, and they meet that criterion. Or plug in anything else you like. A criterion for knowledge which is satisfied because it meets things that are known because they meet the criterion. That is naive dogmatism. It's circular reasoning, and it doesn't work, no matter what the criterion is thought to be. Now, there are two other ways of doing this. There is what Chisholm calls Methodism, not the name of that branch of Protestant Christianity. Methodism is the strategy of responding to the problem of the criterion by starting with the criterion. A Methodist says, I don't actually need to have any particular items of confirmed knowledge in order to know what is a criterion for knowledge. I can start with the criterion. So Chisholm lists, Chisholm lists Hume and Locke as Methodists in this respect. They begin with a method for they begin with a criterion for knowledge, and then they proceed to identify what we know based on that criterion. The final alternative is what Chisholm calls particularism. Start with particular cases of knowledge that we know, and move on from them to determine what is a criterion for knowledge. See what we know and find out based on what we know what is the criterion for knowledge. List some things we know and then see what they have in common or see what they're lacking, and reason inductively from this evidence what is the criterion for knowledge. Now, it is important to note that you can start with particular cases of knowledge and then later derive a criterion and then use it to find some more particular cases of knowledge. Now, Alvin Plantinga does exactly this in his epistemological writings, starting with common sense instances of knowledge borrowed from the earlier philosopher Thomas Reid. Plantinga looks at the reliability of memory beliefs, the fact that other minds exist and their testimony is a source of knowledge, the fact that the world outside my mind exists and my five senses give me some knowledge of it, the reliability of reason, and so on, all the common sense principles of common sense philosophy exemplified by Thomas Reid. Plantinga takes them as the particular cases of knowledge, reasons inductively to what is the criterion for knowledge, and then applies it to another belief and concludes that it satisfies that criterion and therefore it also is knowledge. And it's an interesting analysis because that belief is the existence of God. Now, it's important to note that you can also start with the criterion and then later find some cases of knowledge and then find a second criterion from them. I think this is what Descartes does in his epistemological writings. He starts off as a Methodist. He starts off with a criterion for knowledge, that which survives the method of doubt, that which is absolutely certain, or that which is based on it with really good arguments. So I exist, God exists, and so on. Review Descartes. You should be able to find at least one other video on the subject on this channel. And reasoning from this, Descartes, reasoning from his criterion for knowledge, he gets some instances of knowledge, and then he looks at them and says, I see clearly and distinctly that these things are true. And now I can posit this as a criterion for knowledge. So Descartes begins with the criterion, moves to particular cases of knowledge, and then gets a second criterion. The problem is you can't... the skeptical challenge Chisholm suggests for our consideration is you need the criterion for knowledge in order to get items of knowledge, or at least in order to recognize them. But you need to have some of those in order to know it is a criterion. The Methodist starts on one end and goes to the other end, but then he can always come back to find more and better criteria. And the particularist starts on one side and he goes from there to find the criterion for knowledge, but then he can go back and use that criterion to find some more cases of knowledge. And finally, note that we can actually combine these two approaches of Methodism and particularism. Observe that Methodism is the rejection of one of the premises of the skeptical argument, that it is not possible to recognize a criterion for knowledge unless we first have some cases of knowledge to test it on. And particularism is the rejection of a different premise of that skeptical argument, that we cannot recognize any argument unless we first have a criterion for knowledge. Now, did I say argument? We cannot recognize... Particularism rejects the premise that we cannot recognize any knowledge unless we first have a criterion for knowledge. Now, each of these premises of the skeptical argument might possibly be false. An epistemologist might reject both of them. So there is room for optimism in light of the skeptical challenge. Now, Chisholm himself is an optimist, and he opts for the particularist approach.